Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, James Holland, and with James M. Scott, friend of the show, author of the brilliant Rampage, Black Rain, but also The War Below. And James, you and I are sitting out on your porch in your absolutely stunning house in Mount Pleasant, which is a kind of former little village from the other side of the river, other side of the sea from Charleston in South Carolina, but is now a kind of, what's the name of that TV show they shoot here?
The Outer Banks.
Yeah, so this is where they film the Outer Banks, set for the Outer Banks. And it's an absolutely stunning part of the world. It really is absolutely gorgeous. And the porch is everything you can imagine a traditional American porch should be.
Think Norman Rockwell.
Yeah, think Norman Rockwell, and you're absolutely there. But you know, we've been talking a little bit about Charleston, the history of Charleston, and you showed me Fort Sumter, of course, yesterday, and which was amazing to see because, of course, that's where the Civil War began.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it really is. I mean, there's so much military history runs through Charleston from the Revolutionary War. Of course, the first shots of the Civil War were fired right here. The first battle was for Fort Sumter, right in Charleston Harbor. The first shots actually fired by Citadel cadets, which of course is the military school right here in Charleston as well. So there's really just a long history of American military history that runs right through Charleston, so all the way up until today. Air Force Base still here operating, sending supplies all over the world. I mean, it's very much so.
And also, it's got quite a lot of naval history too, hasn't it? And you've got the USS Yorktown, the second one.
Yep, yeah, the Yorktown is here. The destroyer Laffey is here, and for a little bit longer we have the submarine Clamagore, although it's in pretty bad shape, and I believe they're getting ready to turn it into an artificial reef. It's built at the end of World War II, but served largely as a Cold War vessel. So
what's the Laffey? When was that around?
It was a World War II destroyer. In fact, it had the nickname of the ship that wouldn't die. It was hit by 5 kamikazes. And,
wow.
So is
it Okinawa, was it?
I believe so, yeah.
Philippines?
It's all the latter part of the war there. And because, of course, the kamikazes don't really begin until Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. So it took a beating and kept on going. It's been here for tourists. They redid the hull a few years ago, so it's in good shape. So, yeah. Great. So
I've been reading your book, The War Below, which is just completely brilliant. And as anyone who's been listening to the various episodes over the last couple of years will know, I've got a sort of creeping obsession with the U.S. submarines operating in the Pacific and that whole story. And what you do very cleverly is you follow 3 U.S. submarines, Silverside, Drum, and Tang, through the course of the war, and you chart the whole kind of story and how the U.S. Navy recognized that there was a golden opportunity here to kind of really start to strangle Japanese shipping.
Absolutely, yeah. And the American submarine war in the Pacific, I mean, it really is what eventually breaks the Japanese economy. I know in my most recent book I look at the firebombing and all that because it's a lot easier to visualize burned cities and that kind of wreckage than it is to see, crops rotting on docks in Korea and places like that because the submarine blockade has been so effective and it's broken the backs of the Japanese economy. But the submarine war is a huge part of Japan's defeat, and it really, though, is a war in which the seeds of victory are planted immediately after the First World War.
Right.
Because the Americans saw what Germany did to England and said, you know what, we're going to learn from that. And so they actually got all these captured U-boats, brought them over to the U.S., pulled them all apart, figured out what made German submarine design so much more superior to the American design, and then really spent that interwar period designing one effective boat, and that was, of course, the
this is a Gato class.
Exactly. And so and then what we did is we just mass produced it. So you had one boat that's literally about the length of a football field. It's about 27 feet wide. It's designed to be able to go out to sea for up to 3 months, carry 24 torpedoes, and really be able to take the war to the opposite side of the Pacific. And then,
so it can just travel absolutely thousands of miles.
Totally.
I mean, these are really long patrols, aren't they?
Absolutely.
This is not kind of a couple of weeks.
This is months. This is months, yeah. I mean, they're designed really to be able to go for up to 3 months. And you have to remember, not only are you taking 24 torpedoes, you've got to carry everything from enough food and fuel and all of that for that kind of time period. And so while the engineers are sort of building that perfect boat, you see a real overhaul of how are we going to fight these boats, sort of the strategy for using them. And so often, up until then, submarines were kind of part of fleet activities. They were use them for West Coast defense or the Panama Canal, or as part of fleet operations. And so you had these really great...
So they're a defensive weapon rather than an aggressive attack weapon.
And that's what you see that changes during that interwar period.
So who's driving that? Who are the guys that are kind of leading that
you have
forward?
a core group of submarine officers who were in that interwar period, who saw what happened during World War I, and who are really pushing that. And if just like the same thing with the challenges with naval aviation, which is you're up against a battleship navy, which is you've got these senior leaders in the American military and the American Navy who are
not thinking big and surface.
Not thinking big, thinking everything is going to be an auxiliary to the battleship. And of course, World War II is not about the battleship anymore.
No, it's about carriers.
Yeah, it's a battle. It's war fought in the heavens, and it's a war fought underwater. And that is what defines the naval war so much in the Pacific. And
well, yes, because it's been said that the aircraft carrier before the Second World War, but not everyone had realised it, has usurped the battleship as the preeminent warship.
Yeah.
But actually, I wonder whether you could actually sort of change that and go, maybe the submarine is also on that level in terms of strategic, tactical importance.
Well, I'll be honest with you. The submarine actually is when you think of naval warfare in the Pacific, and you think of big battles like Midway or Leyte Gulf. I mean, you have these flash moments of just hellacious fighting. I mean, Midway. Don't get me wrong. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers lost in the span of 24 hours. That's incredible. But the submarine war is a lot harder. There's not like a single battle. It is a war that's fought day after day, week after week,
truly
month after month. It's absolutely traditional, and it is all about tonnage on the seafloor. And so, in Japan, of course, is a materially bankrupt nation.
So let's just go back. I mean, we've touched on this before on the pod, but about Japan. But it's mainly 4 islands.
Yeah.
Honshu's the big one.
Island,
that's
absolutely.
Tokyo and all the rest of it, and all the main bases. Geographically, it's incredibly varied.
Yeah,
icy snow and kind of mountains in the north, and kind of still mountains in the south, but kind of a bit more temperate, right?
Yeah, and then even tropical. I mean, really, you get down toward like Okinawa and whatnot, and it's
right.
It's
Which is I mean, how far is Okinawa from Honshu?
I mean.
Like 150 miles, or is it more?
Oh, it's more than that. Yeah,
like 250.
Yeah,
no, it's 400, 500.
Yeah, it's a lot bigger. I mean, it's a flight. I mean, you're getting
so it's a long way.
Yeah, it's a
okay,
long
but it's because it's got so many mountains.
Yeah.
The kind of land it's got for agriculture is pretty limited, and certainly not enough to kind of keep 73 million people alive.
Exactly, and it's 85% mountainous, and it affects everything.
85%. I mean, that's a huge amount.
It affects everything about Japan, from the lack of agricultural space to its transportation development. And so, because you can't build train systems through mountains very easily, or road systems, and so
everything's moving by ship, even like sort of coastal convoys, coastal freighters, kind of skipping down between the ports.
Totally,
everything's around the edge.
It's a maritime highway system, and not only that, you're having to import everything. I mean, they can't even grow enough rice for their population, because not only that, I mean, not only did Japan it saw its population triple in the years leading up to World War II, and so literally Japanese seamen are having to go, fishermen are having to go all the way as far as Alaska in order to catch enough fish. Just to be able to support its population. They're having to import food from China, the Philippines, everywhere else around them.
Really?
And so,
and Philippines is a stretch and a half.
Yeah, and so it's the perfect adversary for a submarine war. Because if you can strangle them, you can starve them. Yep. And that's effectively what the submarines do. We ended up in about 288 submarines fighting in the Pacific War, and literally by the end of the war, they decimate the merchant fleet so much so. I mean that they can't even get enough oil in. Battleships are left parked, for anti-aircraft duty. Kamikazes are a direct result of the fact that they can't get enough fuel in there to train their pilots. I mean, it affects every aspect. You can't import enough food, so you see the daily caloric intake of the population plummet. I mean, there's not a segment of that society that's not directly affected by just how successful the American submarine blockade is.
But so what is the level of, you were talking about the Gato class and this development of a half decent submarine in the 1930s, but how big is the submarine arm by kind of 1940, 41? Because one of the kind of great failings, I think, of the Germans in the Second World War is when they developed the Z plan, this naval plan, which gets sort of launched. It's all about battleships and aircraft carriers that, of course, they never build.
Yeah.
At the neglect of the submarine force.
Yeah.
So the BDU, the submarine force, is only about 3,000 men strong in September 1939.
Yeah.
And although you've got a lot of experienced guys there, they're pretty limited. And when you finally do want to suddenly expand, you haven't got that experience, that wealth of experience to spread as you're rapidly expanding. And so therefore you're going to have to cut corners, which means cutting corners on training, cutting corners on skippers. Skippers are going out, just insufficiently trained for the kind of incredibly challenging and difficult task that lies ahead. And that's one of the big failings. Okay, they get up to kind of 300 U-boats, but if the quality's poor, that kind of counts for very little.
Absolutely.
So where's the U.S. Navy in kind of, say 1939?
Yeah, the submarine fleet is very small, and it's particularly small at the outbreak of the war. In fact, we still had leftover S-boats from World War I, which were really just not capable of taking the fight all the way to the far shore. So you see two things happening. You see a massive production drive to build more submarines, so much so that by the end of the war, we're literally building 10 submarines a month. It's crazy, and then you do see a real ramping up of the submariners that are joining it. I mean, it's still a very small arm. I think it's like 16,000 sailors throughout the whole course of the war actually fighting submarines. They're small. I mean, you can't fit but about 80 men on board, and so but they do a really effective job of developing leaders, and they have a policy where successful submarine skippers rotate after about 3 patrols. I
think that's really, really interesting, which of course is one of the failings of the Germans. And it fails at every level. If you're a fighter leader, you're just flying and flying and flying.
So and if you wear out.
You wear out, and exactly that. And it's exactly the same with the U-boat leaders. I mean, very, very few get called off, and so the big 3 aces, people like Preen and Schepke and Kretschmer, they're all killed or captured between March and May 1941, and they've been on the go since September 1939 with no break. I mean, obviously you're breaking after a patrol, but it's kind of go to a patrol, have a little bit of downtime, go out on the next one. It's just relentless. So instead of taking them out and going, okay, train these other guys up, so you haven't got enough quality of people training. Whereas the U.S. Navy doesn't make that mistake right from the outset. It's got what's his name, Burlingame.
Creed Burlingame from Silversides.
From Silversides. He does his view, and then he's involved in training, isn't he?
He goes on to be a division commander, and he's training guys. And so you do see that rotation, and the idea being, as these guys sort of float up, you bring in new blood, you train them, you don't wear them out, etc.
Right.
There is one challenge that I do think the Americans face early in the war, which is they don't know how to fight this submarine. So they develop this sort of perfect weapon, and for this fight, they've got this new strategy, take it all the way to the enemy shores. But these early skippers, you do see a divide amongst the early skippers over how to fight them. And that does become sort of an issue early on, because you do have great skippers like Creed Burlingame, who are like these swashbucklers who have no problems going right into Japanese harbors, going through fishing nets and all that.
He's I mean, he's a hell of a character, isn't he? He's got this sort of slightly kind of squashed nose, and he's chunky, and he's known as Burly, isn't he? And he's a sort of salty sea dog type, and drinks hard when he's on shore.
And he lived right here in Mount Pleasant.
No.
In fact, actually, he had a house on the other side of town, and
that's amazing.
It sold a few years ago, and it was being advertised as the Admiral's house.
Wow!
And
so he became Admiral Bellingham.
Yeah, and in fact, he actually taught at the middle school 2 blocks from here, Moultrie Middle School, where my son went. And so it was a high school at the time. But when I was going through his personnel files at the Naval Academy, I found.
He became a teacher.
Became a history teacher.
What? That just feels all wrong. I just feel he should have been kind of sort of taking boats out till the very end.
No, man, he went on and taught history, and people loved him. It's so funny. I mean, when the book came out here, all my neighbors were like, "Oh my God, Creed Burlingame, he used to live right around here."
That's incredible.
But he was this amazing skipper in the beginning of the war, and he was fearless. And so it took these early skippers to be able to figure out, all right, how well does the camouflage work on these boats? How can the Japanese see us? At what range can they see us?
Right.
How do we fight? Do you
do it at night and come on the surface, or do you stay under the water?
And so you really see that happening. And I think there's a pretty transformative figure in Mush Morton.
Right.
And he's one of my favorites. Of course, he is the skipper on the Wahoo. And unfortunately, he is one who is lost in the war because he won't follow the advice of the Navy and give it up. And he wears himself out, and he's eventually lost. But he had been a wrestler at the Naval Academy. And so he applied the philosophy of wrestling, which is you have to get in close and you have to grapple with your opponent.
Right.
And so he took that to submarine fighting. And so he would get right up on the Japanese convoy, and he would fire, and he would fire again, and he would continue to press the attack until he eventually sank the first convoy. And I think later on it was kind of, well, one of them may have gotten away, so it wasn't that. But initially he's credited with being the first submarine skipper to sink an entire Japanese convoy. And he applied, and that strategy kind of.
And how I mean, you're not talking convoys of 42 ships.
No,
like
it's
you
like
are
4. Yeah,
it's
like 4. Because the Japanese convoys were much, much smaller systems than what we saw in the Atlantic. I mean, they were, and early on in the war, they didn't even use escorts. I mean, so it was really just, you'd find a handful of merchant ships and
off you go.
And off you go. And so, but yeah, so he's really kind of I think he's kind of the fulcrum in a lot of ways on how the submarine war works, because he really kind of comes in and revolutionizes submarine warfare. And skippers realize at that point, well, hey, we can get a lot closer to Japanese convoys and not be seen. We can fight, as you said, we spot them during the day, and instead of engaging right away, we follow them all day, and then we attack under the cover of darkness at night. And they really become hunters.
Yeah.
And
well, that's what the U-boats are doing in the Atlantic. It's most attacks are at night.
Yeah, and so they have to, but there's that learning curve, and and it takes guys like Creed Burlingame and Mushport to kind of figure that out. So much so that by the middle of the war, you really began seeing just Japanese ship after ship going down, and by the end of the war, there's nothing left. I mean, these guys are out there and they're fighting over sampans. I mean, there's just they've destroyed.
They've
Japan, of course,
in Japan, and they don't have the capacity to rebuild that fleet.
Exactly. In Japan, I
mean, that's exactly what happens to the Italians and Axis forces in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
By the time of the Sicily invasion, it's just little coastal lighters and this kind of stuff, because all the big ones are gone.
Yeah, and it's funny because like the skipper of the drum is this. He's the Maurice Renskoff is the youngest skipper of World War II. He's 26 years old when he takes command of the drum. And
I can see him building to this moment in the book. He starts off kind of sort of third or fourth peg, and then he's gunnery officer, isn't he, or something?
He's like the mess officer. He's like having
works his way up.
Works his way up, takes over, becomes the youngest submarine, which is crazy to think that this 26-year-old is put in trust of this high tech submarine of its era. But by the time he's ready and he goes out to fight, there's nothing left to shoot. And there's a frustration for these young skippers that, hey, we've worked our way up, we're given our chance, and here's this sampan with a crew of 8 people on board. That's kind of what you're left with.
But once war begins, once Pearl Harbor's gone, and there is this sudden realization, gosh, actually, we need to start using our submarines. Who's running the show? I mean, obviously it's Nimitz at the top and King, but how is it organised? I mean, you have task force and stuff, and you've got Bull Halsey and all the rest of it running around with sort of carriers and battleships and cruisers and destroyers. How is it structured? What's the structure of the US submarine
basically they're running.
You talk about divisions.
They're running two operations essentially. One is out of Hawaii, and the other is out of Australia. And so they essentially
whereabouts in Australia?
It's Brisbane. And so and they basically kind of carve up, because you have to remember the Pacific Ocean's huge, 65 million square miles. Where are you going to go to find your targets? And so they really basically map out the whole Pacific. And it's great when you find these maps and you look at them in the National Archives. They're fascinating. They basically create block systems all over the Pacific. And so each submarine going out is assigned a block. And you go into that area, and anything you see in that area, you shoot. Yeah, you're the only boat assigned to that area. And so if it's there, it's fair game. And so they basically carve it up, and they sort of say, all right, the boats out of Australia and Brisbane, this is going to be your target areas, and Hawaii, this is going to be yours. And eventually, and the leader of it all, of course, is a guy by the name of Charles Lockwood, Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood. And he is...
And he's a great man, isn't he?
Oh, he's great. And
what's his background?
He actually had been he fought in submarines during World War I, and so he's actually was part of that whole process of bringing.
Yes, because he starts on battleships, doesn't he? Or something, and thinks, I don't want this.
Yeah, and exactly, and goes out on his first submarine ride, and he's like, wow, this is the future of warfare for the Navy.
The Damascene moment.
Yeah, and switches over, ends up in World War I, is part of that whole group that brings German subs back, pulls them apart. Spends his entire interwar period sort of fighting for to change the tactics that are being used. He's actually in London as an attaché when the war breaks out.
Yeah, and he's still there, isn't he, when the Blitz begins?
Yeah, and so he is desperate to get back into submarines, and he eventually does. And he comes in, and he rises up to become sort of the father of the American submarine war in the Pacific.
Hugely respected. Totally. Doesn't really put a foot wrong.
Yeah, wrote a bunch of books afterwards. I mean, just people loved him. They called him Uncle Charlie. I mean, he was just a really great guy, but understood what you could do with an American submarine against an adversary like Japan.
And he's based in Australia, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
So when you say a division, so what's a division? Is that how does that work?
Yeah, they break it up into certain boats. I think it's 6 boats to a division, basically. Oh, okay. And so it's really just kind of a way in which to arrange them all.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back shortly. See you in a moment. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. These divisions aren't really operating in the same way as a Wolfpack because of the scale.
They're independent fighters. And the Wolfpacks really come along later in the war as essentially as we get more and more boats. I mean, early in the war, you got to remember, we don't have that many boats.
No.
And so you really, this idea that you're going to fight as a team just simply, it's an impossibility. You've got to be able, because remember, for every boat that's out on patrol, you actually have to have 2 other boats, essentially. It's 3 boats. So because the going and the coming.
Going back and another one, and then repairs and training up.
And all that kind of stuff. I mean, so it's like, you have 100 boats, you're really only going to have 35. A third of those, exactly, out on patrol at one time. Because the distance, I mean, just to get from Pearl Harbor to Japan is like almost 2 weeks.
Yes.
And so
going at 20 knots.
Yeah, I mean, and on the surface, that's exactly what they're doing. So, I mean, just you're looking almost.
But to be fair, that's quite a bit faster than a Type 7 U-boat, for example, which can do 14 to 16 knots, something like that. I mean, 20 knots is not slow.
And you're going over 3,000 miles. I mean, you're literally going across half the Pacific Ocean to get there. So, but the distances are big. Not until later in the war when you have enough boats that you can bring in and have the Wolfpacks and whatnot. And so that kind of becomes really more of a.
So they do operate Wolfpacks, but just
later in the war, exactly. Right, and that's when you have enough boats. And then at that point, too, the Japanese empire has shrunk. Because you have to remember, at the beginning of the war, I mean, the Japanese are fighting all the way. I mean, they're doing raids in Darwin, Australia. I mean, they're everywhere. And so, but by the latter part, by 1944, they've really been isolated to the Philippines, and then sort of the defensive perimeter, the internal defensive perimeter of the Japanese empire. So the distances have shrunk, and so everybody's kind of coming in, and at that point too. And the Wolfpacks are highly successful too. I mean, because you kind of come in just like a wolf, you attack over and over and over again. Japanese convoys, and of course the tragedy at that point too is some of those ships are being used to transport American prisoners of war and Allied prisoners of war back to the homeland, to the main island of Honshu, to dig air raid shelters, work in mines.
Land up the bottom as well.
Exactly. So that's kind of one of the big tragedies, because the Japanese never marked any of those boats.
So we don't know.
Yeah,
we still don't know what.
We know. No, there were some survivors on some, like the Arison Maru is one of the worst. I think like almost 2,000 folks went down on that. I think it was like 1,800 went down. There were about 9 survivors, I believe. So we know some anecdotal stuff like that. But there may be others. They were the hell ships, as they call them.
Yeah. I remember talking to someone who'd been on a hell ship, and it did sound like a hell ship. I mean, it wasn't a name that was used lightly.
God. I mean,
it was horrific.
I think one of the best descriptions, and for listeners who may not be familiar, I mean, this is how Japanese transported Allied prisoners of war. They just packed so many people inside the hull of a ship without, of course, no air conditioning, no air movement, no nothing, in the tropics, and would steam them back to Japan. No toilet facilities, any of that. And one guy described it best. It's like putting marbles in a jar. And eventually you just can't fit another marble in there. Nothing will move. And he's like, that's what it was. And of course, the heat on board was, well over 100 degrees. I mean, you have stories of people drinking urine, literally cutting people to drink their blood. I mean, it's just horrific stories that come out of those hell ships.
So you've got this vast expanse of the Pacific, and you've got this comparatively few numbers of submarines operating there. How are they discovering where a kind of convoy of 4 little Japanese ships is coming from? Because it's a big old place, and 4 ships is very, very easy to lose.
Yeah, no,
or
exactly.
Just never find.
Well, and there are a couple different ways. Early in the war, it's really trial and error. I mean, because what they do is when they're mapping out sort of these patrol areas, as I was talking about earlier on these maps, they figure, well, we'll put them around.
When you say early in the war, we're talking 1942.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're putting the patrol areas are going to be around areas that you're going to have boats coming into. They're going to be major sea lanes, ports, things of that nature, where there's Japanese are going to be moving supplies, moving ships. By 43, we actually break the Japanese code, the Maru code, and so at that point,
is that the JN-25 or whatever?
Yeah,
it's
the
and so the JN-25.
The JN-25 is their naval code. Yeah, and so we actually at that point can start reading their maritime traffic, so we can direct submarines and say, on such and such date at noon, you can go to these coordinates. And
but that in itself is quite a big deal, isn't it? I mean, to be able to crack that. I mean, we all know about Enigma machines and stuff, but how do the Japanese code their material? Do they have an Enigma machine equivalent?
Oh gosh, of course now you're going to make me dig back in my memory on that. They had a.
It's got about sort of 3 different levels, hasn't it?
Yeah, it kind of went through. You had to have certain keys, and it went through.
Don't worry. But I mean, it's incredibly complicated.
It is, and it had to you had to sort of have the key on one end and then undo it. I mean, it was a multiple layered process in which things were done. And
so to break it is is an incredible feat of...
It was, and so I think, as I recall, the FBI raided the Japanese embassy and stole some of the code books, and then hired professors who had worked in Tokyo to help understand it all and apply it, and then of course a lot of it was trial and error and whatnot. So, but by 43, we're at a point
they've got it.
They can read it exactly, and so they know at that point. So, hey, all right, on such and such date, you'll find at these coordinates, you'll find this, and so at that point, all you got to do is show up and wait.
Yeah.
And so then the destruction.
Yeah, because what's amazing is how often they sort of go, okay, I'm here, and whoa, there it is. There they are. I mean, literally every single time.
That's the beauty of Japanese efficiency. I mean, one of my favorite stories is, at the shoot down of Admiral Yamamoto in 1943 is because, somebody sent out a message saying, the Admiral's going to arrive at 9:03 a.m., at such and such airfield, and
he is.
And he shows up, and so the U.S. plots this entire strategy based on an arrival at 9:03 a.m., and you back out how long it's going to take to fly and whatnot, and they intercept him within a minute. I mean, so Japanese punctuality doomed Yamamoto, and it dooms so many of these boats as well.
Yeah. Wow. So so they've got that from 1943 onwards.
Yeah.
Also, one of the ongoing problems is the issues of the fish, the torpedoes.
Yeah.
That are just total duds, and again it's Lockwood who kind of unlocks all that, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the big travesties of the early part of the submarine war, because a lot of great opportunities for destruction were lost. And what it came down to is, for folks that don't know, I mean, a torpedo is actually a very sophisticated weapon. I mean,
of course.
It's not just an underwater rocket. I mean, it's essentially a submarine. It runs off of fuel, and it's got twin propellers and whatnot, and so it. And they were very, very expensive. They were about $2,500. Or no, I think they were about $10,000.
Yeah, $10,000 each, aren't they?
And so it was about, actually, as I recall, about $2,500 was a naval ensign's salary for a year. So I mean, really, like one torpedo costs what it would, the wages of 4 young officers in the Navy. And so, but they were designed so that they would go underneath the keel of a ship. They would detect the change in the magnetic field there and then detonate, or they were designed to hit and detonate on impact. But they had all these problems, and so these skippers early on in the war were going out.
Well, they were set too low, weren't they?
Yeah, so they were. Well, they didn't know that initially. So they go out, and these skippers are taking these shots, and they're missing, and they're like, "Man, I was right up on this convoy. How did I miss?" So they were coming back, and they were reporting these problems, and so they had the Bureau of Ordnance, they called it the Gun Club, was saying, no, we have a perfect weapon. You guys are just bad shots.
Yeah.
And it really
plays those tools.
And it demoralized a lot of these guys.
Yeah,
and so
why
some of them
wouldn't
said,
it?
look, hey, if I can't hit it, I'm going to get out and let somebody who's better than I get in. And so it really takes Lockwood figuring out and saying, you know what, he believed his guys. And so what he did is, down in Australia, he gets these fishermen, and they string up these nets, and they fire some practice torpedoes, and lo and behold, they realize that they're running too deep.
Yep.
And so, and at that point, from then on, they kind of have to start jury rigging things to kind of make it work. And you change it a little bit, and you create another problem here. But they effectively solve the problem and sort of get it back up. But the big
but don't they then develop a kind of an upgraded torpedo? Or am I imagining that?
No, I mean they do. They get the electric torpedo later on.
That's it. Yeah.
But this one, the gas-powered torpedoes, is much faster, longer range, all of that kind of stuff. And so, but they do, and they ultimately will fight the war with both throughout. But the challenge they have is that all these opportunities, because early in the war, Japan they didn't use escorts. So you got there, I mean, you had skippers coming across, convoys just full of supplies and fuel and all that they couldn't hit.
Yeah.
And so by later on in the war, Japan does, after they start losing boats, develop a very extensive convoy system and escorts and all that. It makes the job much, much harder. So all this 18 months of lost opportunity could have brought the Japanese economy crashing down even earlier.
It's amazing for a nation that is so brilliant in terms of technology and engineering, and investing so much time and effort into its war aims, doesn't put a little bit more emphasis on this earlier on. I mean, and you see this, of course, it's human nature, and it's just, you see this at every level with every nation. They're always making mistakes, of course, because there is so much to think about. But it's amazing, isn't it, with the submarine force? It's kind of sort of out of sight, out of mind a little bit, and you can see the kind of the preeminence of the carrier and the kind of surface vessels. It's kind of, sort of reign supreme, and so the submarine forces never seem to get, whether they be German, whether they be British, whether they be American or whatever, or Japanese, they never seem to get quite the kind of the priority that they should do.
Yeah, and part of that for the U.S. was it was so highly secretive, and so they didn't want to broadcast that. I mean, that said, later on in the war, you did have these huge submarine skippers who became celebrities, but they were really guarded about the type of successes they were having because they didn't want to alert the enemy. The interesting thing about the Japanese is that they failed to ever grasp the importance of the submarine. You saw that interwar period in the U.S. really coalesce around a strategy and a new type of submarine. And the Japanese, meanwhile, are tinkering, and they build a whole... I mean, they have everything from midget submarines to boats that are big enough to carry float planes. Yeah, and so they never come up with a coherent strategy for how to fight them. So they use them largely as part of their surface fleet. And meanwhile, the Americans had these massive convoys coming all the way across the Pacific to fight. I mean, would just been sitting prey, for the Japanese to do the exact same thing we did. In fact, the German attachés are constantly telling the Japanese, "You've got to look at what the Americans are doing to you. You've got to adopt the same type of tactics."
And what do they say in response?
They're like, no. I mean, because the Japanese were constantly fighting the last war. I mean, so the one area that they had success in early in the war was they did realize the value of carrier aviation, and Pearl Harbor is a perfect example of that. And Yamamoto is a big part of that because he is Admiral Yamamoto had gone to school at Harvard. He'd spent a lot of time in North America. I mean, he was picked up one time going around oil refineries in Mexico. I mean, people understood that. Yamamoto understood that, hey, this is going to be a different type of war. But so much of the naval establishment in Japan didn't. They were constantly thinking, we're going to have this one big sea battle, and it's going to shape everything. Well, we did have that one big sea battle. And it's called Midway, and you lost it. Or Leyte Gulf, for example.
But there might be another one. We might win that one.
And so they really, and the same thing with the submarines is they're constantly, they don't see that, hey, why don't we look at what happened to Great Britain during World War I with submarines, and why don't we recognize that we're also an island nation? And then even as it's happening to them, even as the American submarines are just destroying their merchant fleets, they don't change their tactics.
And they don't think, actually, why don't we try and destroy the American merchant fleets?
Exactly. There's none of that. And of course, the convoys that we're bringing in, I mean, for example, for the invasion of Luzon, I mean, it's like over 1,000 ships bringing hundreds of thousands of troops, all the supplies, the vehicles, the fuel, the food, the pallets of stuff. All that would have been right for that. And they just never embraced that. And they also were really bad with anti-submarine technology. They absolutely believed that a lookout was far superior than radar. And of course, that doesn't work well at night. No. I mean, it really doesn't.
Well, those Gator classes, I mean, they've all got radar on board right from the word go, haven't they?
Yeah, they and the Americans become big believers in radar. And big,
why wouldn't you?
Yeah, and so all the skippers did, and so they, but the Japanese didn't, and it's extraordinary. It's blind spot after blind spot after blind spot.
But why is that? I mean, it's so bizarre, isn't it? It seems so obvious. You would have thought someone kind of high up would go, hang on a minute, chaps.
Well, and just what happens, too, is so they start losing all their senior people. I mean, Yamamoto gets shot down. You go through... then
everyone else is sort of, kills themselves when their ship goes down.
So, I mean, you really see just this massive attrition of their senior leaders.
So the torpedoes improve, and then, you have these incredible submarines like the Wahoo and like Tang and so on, and Drum that just start accumulating huge amounts of enemy shipping.
Oh yeah, I mean the Tang is one of the, I mean, Dick O'Kane was a protege of Mush Morton. I mean, they were really good friends. So I mean, he was his executive officer, so he helped Mush Morton pioneer these new tactics. And then of course, when it's time for Dick to take over his own boat, he goes back to California to Mare Island to pick up the Tang, and that's when Morton is lost. And so he refuses to believe it. How could the Japanese get Mush Morton, his best friend? And of course, so he shows back up in Hawaii, and the first thing he does is he goes to see, his, I think it's Admiral Lockwood at the time, and he says, I need to understand, did they actually get him? And he confirms that they did. And so really, O'Kane then goes out on one of the most destructive submarine campaigns. I mean, he's literally sinking a ship for every 10 days he's on patrol. I mean, it's just racking up just staggering numbers of... and he only serves 5 patrols before, the Tang is sadly hit by one of its own torpedoes. I mean, one of these fluke moments where a torpedo malfunctioned and it sort of porpoised and it circled all the way back. And so Dick ends up in a Japanese prisoner of war camp.
Ouch.
And yeah, exactly. And spends the better part of the last year in prison.
And what happens to him in the end?
He so
because he's one of the legends, isn't he? Of the submarine war in the Pacific.
Totally, and
as is Mush Morton, of course.
Yeah, they really are. In a lot of ways, I think the two of them kind of are sort of that top of that pyramid, so to speak.
Right.
Because both of those boats are just two of the most successful boats. And the amazing thing about it is the Tang does that in 9 months. I mean, that's how little. I mean, Silverside is a highly successful boat. It fights the entire war.
Yeah.
The Drum is very successful, but it fights the entire war.
Yeah.
Tang does it in like literally less than a year. Yep. And it comes down to just the crazy tenacity of your skipper and a bit of luck, but Dick O'Kane was a really great submarine skipper. So anyway, they get hit by their own torpedo off the Chinese coast. Their boat actually goes down, and so a lot of the guys have to escape from 180 feet down. Make
That's
their way
insane,
up,
isn't
and
it?
so
Wow.
they're out of a crew of I think about 87. I think it's about 9 of them survive,
Wow.
and they are captured by the Japanese, and they're beaten, tortured, and
the full works.
starved, all that kind of stuff. They're sent to Campo Funo, which is this unregistered prisoner of war camp, and
How many of them survived that?
most of those guys did survive, but it was a brutal existence.
Yep.
They
Of course.
they came out all weighing less than 100 pounds.
Yeah.
They had teeth knocked out from being punched
yeah.
on. They witnessed just awful treatment of themselves and their other prisoners.
And what happens to O'Kane in the post-war?
So he ends up in the Navy for a while, and then he eventually gets out, and he's one of those guys. He's never able to let go of what happens to him there. In fact, he developed Alzheimer's later in life. He tragically was constantly saying to his wife, he would go out toward the sea and say, I've got to go get my men. I've got to go get my men. And it really, those losses haunted him. And so he, all the way up until he died. And so he...
When did he pass away?
oh, God, probably back in the 90s, as I recall.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So a while ago.
So he had a highly successful son, actually. His son, Jim O'Kane, went on to design the helmet that's used by astronauts.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're really a
Wow.
quite a family.
family.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It makes me feel I haven't done enough in life.
You'd be the same. Wow.
Yeah.
And let's just before we stop, let's just talk about kind of life on board.
Yeah.
And it's challenging to say the least. But one of the things I thought was amazing was to discover that they still, American servicemen still have to have their Coca-Cola, and they still get that even on submarines. But they get around the problem by having effectively a soda stream and cola syrup that you put in the water. I mean, that's just incredible.
Well, that's exactly. You have to remember. I mean, you've got this boat that's only 27 feet wide, and you've got to carry enough food, fuel, and supplies for 80 men for up to 3 months. And so the boat becomes a pantry. And so they literally fill the entire shower full of condensed milk and whatnot. And so. And of course, how do you keep food fresh that long?
Yeah.
The idea is you can't. I mean, you take fresh food out and you eat.
But you've got freezers. There's freezers.
You do
in
have
there,
huge
fridges, which is amazing.
And so they took.
I absolutely know that there's not a British wartime or German wartime submarine that has a fridge or a freezer in it.
Oh yeah, no, they definitely did, and so they
quite right too.
And they carried. And I'll tell you, one of the great finds I had was when the drum actually the drum is now a museum ship in Mobile, Alabama, and so
is it?
It is, yeah. And so they
oh wow.
When they decommissioned it and made it into a museum ship, they pulled all the batteries out. And inside the battery well, they left a whole bunch of bankers' boxes of World War II records. And so when I was doing my research, I went through all those records. Yeah. And one of the things I was most interested in is the commissary receipts. Because I'm like, how do you shop for a submarine?
Yeah.
And it was interesting because they were buying like 1,800 dozen eggs to take out there. I mean, they were taking like 5,000 pounds of chicken. And of course, you take boneless chicken because the bone is just... It's wasted space. It's wasted. So they had to be really, really crafty with that. But it was so interesting to look at that because as what happens is you eat all your fresh food first, and then you move into your canned food. And so the good cooks learned things like, cabbage stays fresh the longest.
Yeah, that was amazing.
And so they. And also, that you could, your flour invariably gets weevils in it, and so that rather than try to sift them all out, the smart cooks just kind of threw in caraway seeds and baked rye bread, figuring the sailors will never notice that we've sort of baked this extra protein in their bread. So they did. You couldn't take big things of Coca-Cola, so you took the syrup and you carbonated the water yourself. I mean, so everything had to be. It was fascinating how they thought of everything to be able to do that. And
but if you're doing those long trips, you need a few creature comforts, or else you're just going to go mad. I mean,
exactly. And that's the thing is
you're in an incredibly brutal and tough environment. Yeah. I mean, you've got to be so tough. And to kind of put up with one of those patrols, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, and
just to exist.
Just to exist.
Forget the fighting bit. Forget the risk.
Some of these guys, if you're not on lookout, you don't see daylight for 3 months. If you're down below, and you have to remember these boats they get when they turn off, when for instance they're being depth charged, they shut down the air conditioning system, so it gets incredibly hot and humid on them at that time. And so they tell if you're doing silent running like that, if you're not in a battle station, you go lay in a bunk and you just lay there. as depth charges are coming down around you, and it's hot and it's humid and it smells like sweat.
And the next one could be your end.
The next one could be your end. And so you have these kind of moments like that. And there's no, of course, there's no entertainment. There's no Facebook. There's no Twitter. So you took a box of 1,000 paperback novels that they took with them, and they took phonographs. And one of the best things I found in one of the letters of a Silverside's officer, and he served almost the entire war on board, which was kind of a fluke. But he wrote a letter to his wife. He said, "I've been on board now. I have burned through 5 1,000 record needles on my phonographs." I mean, he'd played 5,000 records over the course of his time on that. I mean, just think about that. I mean, how much AC/DC can you play?
Well, yes. I mean, who would be the kind of the crooners of the day? I mean, crikey.
So, I mean, it really is. I mean, it's just you got to really like the guys you're with.
And you've got to trust them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you've got this incredible story about the ship's pharmacist, and I love this. So basically, there isn't the space or the capacity to have a medical officer there who is like a doctor.
Yeah.
So you have the next best thing, which is someone who has a crash course in kind of first aid.
Yeah, he's a pharmacist, mate, and he's got 12 weeks of training. I mean, they called him the quack. I mean, he's there for your catastrophic
injuries. It's like a course of leeches. It's kind of about the level of his knowledge.
Exactly.
And there's this incredible story of the guy having his appendix taken out.
Exactly. So here they are off for a ball on the Silversides, and it's like a few days before Christmas, 1942, and one of the guys comes down with appendicitis. And of course, what are you going to do? You're on
you're in the middle of the Pacific.
Yeah, and none of that.
It's a really bad time to get appendicitis.
You're right off this Japanese base. It's not like you can just surface and call in a float plane. So it's like, so Creed Burlingame has to tell this young pharmacist, he's like, well, you're just going to have to operate on him. And this guy's like, I don't know what I'm doing. And so they actually prepare the wardroom in the Silversides as his operating table. And
I love the fact that he's too long for the
wardroom ironing board.
The ironing board to kind of put his feet on.
Well, the Silversides is a museum ship today.
Is it?
In Muskegon, Michigan. And so when I was working on this, I went up there and I went in that wardroom and I sat there because I wanted to, just like you walking battlefields, you want to experience.
Wow.
So,
I had no idea.
And I took a tape measure, and you measure how long the table is and all of that. But yes, so they have to literally prop him up on this and put him under. And of course, the executive officer on the ship was an amateur photographer, and so he shot photographs of this surgery.
Well, and you've got one in the book.
Oh yeah, and it's amazing. And here these guys are shirtless, sweating, doing this surgery. I mean, one guy's holding.
And Tom, what's the name of the pharmacist's mate? Tom something or other. Is it Moore?
Tom Moore, exactly.
Tom Moore,
yeah.
and you can
George
see him.
Platter,
He's literally just wearing a vest, and the photo that you put in the book is of him leaning over, and it's just this intense concentration.
Yeah, I mean,
it's just incredible.
This surgery that would normally take 15 minutes today takes him like 4 hours.
Yeah, but because he does the incision, doesn't he?
Does
And he identifies the appendix, and he chops it off, pulls it out, and that's all cool. And then he does just a little swab just to make sure that he's, cauterized it properly, no internal bleeding. And there's lots of internal bleeding. And he just thinks, oh my God, where's this coming from? So then he starts pulling out the poor guy's intestines, going, like you would on a kind of sort of repairing a bicycle puncture. Kind of, where's the hole?
Yeah.
It's just extraordinary. And it takes him, and the guy wakes up, doesn't he?
The guy wakes up, and so, because, and so he ultimately has to
looks down, sees some of his guts coming out.
He's literally pulling them out, and he's going, searching them inch by inch, trying to figure out where this bleeder's coming from. He's pouring sweat at this point. He's like, I'm going to kill this guy. I mean, can you imagine the stress on this young guy?
He's like 22, isn't he?
22 years old, 12 weeks of training.
Yeah.
And so the guy wakes up, and they're like, "Oh my God, we've got to re-anesthetize him." And so they open up a can of ether, which
is a problem because
you're on an enclosed ventilation system, and
so everyone gets etherized.
So I interviewed one guy who lived here in Mount Pleasant that served on that patrol, and so he was in the conning tower, and he said everybody got woozy. I mean, throughout that entire boat, and so but they knock him back out. He does eventually find kind of the where he was bleeding from. It had been hidden behind a towel he'd used for prep work, and he's able to kind of seal it off, stitch him back up, and of course George Platter goes on to live into his 80s. In fact, one of the great things too, and Tom Moore's son ended up becoming a doctor and a surgeon later on in life. So
wow! But
it's a great story, and that I mean, really, and there were a couple of those types of stories during World War II, but it's the Silversides. That's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. I mean, I was when you're reading it, you're just thinking, "Come on, find it." Yeah, it's just incredible. I mean, it is. I mean, how would you place what those submarines achieved in its part in total victory against Japan.
It's a huge part of it. I mean, in fact, and so, and of course, here I am.
And yet the least known.
It is, and here I am on the one hand. So I've written this book on the great success of the submarine war, and then I've also
now
written
you're
this
doing
book
Tokyo.
on the firebombing of Tokyo and the destruction by the air campaign. And of course, both sides claim total credit. But the reality is that Japan's economy by the summer of 1944 has sort of crossed its apex, and it's beginning its sort of death spiral. And that's before the first B-29 even takes off.
I just can't get my head around the fact that 88% of Japanese GDP is spent on defense by late 1944.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just incredible.
And they can't get anything in anymore. They can't get any supplies in. So there's no ability to build new fighters much. There's no ability to, I mean, they're working off stockpiles at that point because you just cannot get the raw. And so that's what the submarines really accomplish. They break the back of the Japanese economy. But here's the thing. It's really hard for the Japanese public, because at the end, America's also trying to demonstrate to the Japanese public that they're defeated, so that they can break through the propaganda.
Yep.
And it's really hard to do that by saying, well, you're not getting enough bauxite in to build for aluminum and do that. So that is where the air war kind of comes in, because the air war then demonstrates the American superiority, the destruction of Japan's cities and things like that. So it's really this 1-2 punch. And the U.S. Strategic Bomb Survey actually said, I mean, Japan's economy was effectively destroyed twice over. Once by the submarine war, which broke the back of its economy, and second by the reduction of its cities through firebombing.
Right.
And so those two things really, I think, it's the 1-2 punch that brings them to an end.
And do you think Admiral Leahy was right that you didn't need to kind of drop a bomb? You could just you could just starve Japan out and then eventually save the whole thing.
That's where Japan was in that process. It would have just taken a lot longer. The Japanese were used to a smaller diet than the Americans and whatnot. I mean, they were their daily caloric intake was already traditionally lower than the Americans. They had shown themselves to be very resourceful in how long they could hold out. So how long do you want to hold out? I mean, how long is the world's patience? Because also at that point you have to remember, about 100,000 people are dying every month in Asia. I mean, China loses 20 million people over the course of the war. So the longer you drag this out, you're leading to more starvation, more battle deaths, things like that. And I think the American perspective was, we have to end this. And so, and the atomic bomb does give, if you look at what Hirohito says in his rescript there, he blames it. It gives him a political tool to say, all right, we're out. We're done. But there was a lot of fear, after the first atomic bombs dropped and Japan doesn't surrender. I mean, there's a sense of like, oh my God, did this, we thought
really?
This, because Marshall says, look, hey, they didn't surrender after the Tokyo firebombing. We had to up our ante, so to speak. And then after Hiroshima, they're like, here it is, like August 7th, August 8th. They're like, Japan hadn't surrendered. We've only got one bomb left. I mean, what's it going to take? And of course, after Nagasaki, they eventually do. But yeah, so that's the intensity of that whole end of the war. But yeah, and LeMay and so some of those guys too. They didn't think that. Look, Japan. The only reason Hiroshima existed as a target was because LeMay had been ordered to hold back a few bigger cities so that they could test the weapon. I mean, as LeMay said, all the heavy lifting was done. I mean, by that point in the war, he's burning down cities with a population of 35,000. I mean, he's just burned through Japan's major cities, its secondary cities, and now its tertiary cities. So, the atomic bomb is really, it doesn't have that sort of effect that beyond,
because they're already
beat, they're already defeated. And so the idea is that it's like you've convinced them that they're defeated. How do you convince them to surrender unconditionally? And so, but that's what, if you look at what Hirohito said, the atomic bomb gives him the face-saving way out.
Wow. A lot to think about there. James, thank you. That's been fantastic. Really, really, really interesting.
Jim, thanks for having me back on.
Cheerio.